The first bullet came through the east window at 11:47 p.m., and Grace Bellamy knew the sound before the glass finished falling. She was in the second-floor gallery, with a folded stack of linens against her hip, when it happened that flat, tearing crack of a suppressed round punching through a pane, followed by the soft, wet cough of a man somewhere below losing the ability to breathe. Most people would have frozen. Most people would have told themselves it was a car backfiring, a firework, a dropped tray in the kitchen. Grace set the linens down on the console table without a single wrinkle, and every warm, rounded, unremarkable thing about her went still and cold and precise, the way a lake goes still right before it freezes solid. 6 years. She had gone 6 years without hearing that exact sound, and her body remembered it like a first language. Downstairs, in the wide black marble foyer of the Volkov estate, Nikolai Volkov was already reaching for the gun that lived at the small of his back. He was a tall man, carved out of winter silver, threading the dark hair at his temples, a face that had frightened senators and made rival families sign whatever he slid across a table without reading it. He had survived 3 wars over territory that appeared on no map anyone could subpoena. He knew the sound, too. But he was a half-second slow tonight, tired, a glass of untouched whiskey warming on the closed lid of the piano he never played, and the second round caught him high in the left shoulder and spun him into the banister with a grunt that was more insult than pain. Blood, black in the low light, bloomed fast across the white of his shirt. They came through the front and the service entrance at once, 4, 5, moving with the ugly efficiency of professionals who had been paid extremely well and expected to be home before 1. Nikolai's own men were already down. He'd heard them go, one after another. Over the last 90 seconds, Yuri at the gate, the Petrov brothers in the drive at demolition so quiet and so complete that even he, who had ordered exactly this kind of thing done to other men in other houses, felt the floor tilt under the certainty of it. He was going to die in his own foyer. He had time to think that, clearly, with a strange bureaucratic calm, the way a man reads a sentence he already knows the end of. And then a soft voice said, out of the dark of the stairs, down, now. He turned, gun rising, and there was Grace, his housekeeper, the heavy-set, gentle-eyed woman who had worked in his home for 11 months, who left shortbread on a plate outside his study when he worked too late, who hummed old songs under her breath while she polished the silver, who had never once in his memory raised her voice above the register you'd use to ask if he wanted his coffee refreshed. She was standing 3 steps up with her apron still tied around her waist, and she was not looking at him. She was looking past him at the doorway, at the men, at the geometry of the room, and her eyes had gone to something he had no word for. Flat, clear, and utterly, impossibly without fear. Grace, he said, get back, get up the stairs. She hit him. Not a slap. A full drive of her shoulder into his wounded side, all of her considerable weight behind it, timed to the exact instant his balance was already broken, and the shock of it, and the white blaze of pain of it, took his legs out from under him and sent him backward through the narrow door beside the staircase, the one he had shown her, months ago, in an offhand voice, because he trusted her enough to show her where he'd hide, and was cynical enough to assume she would never in her life need to know. The panic room. He hit the floor inside on his good shoulder, twisted, came up snarling with his gun leveled at her chest, and she was already stepping back out over the threshold, already reaching for the heavy door with a hand that did not shake. What are you? Stay in there. Her voice was so calm it stopped him more surely than any weapon could have. There are cameras. Watch if you want. Don't open this door for anyone but me. Grace. If it's not my voice, she said, don't open it at all. Not for anything you hear. Do you understand me? She swung the door shut. The magnetic bolts drove home with a sound like a bank vault ceiling, and Nikolai Volkov, the shadow ruler of half of New York, the man whose name other men used to frighten their sons, was locked inside a steel box, 6 feet square, bleeding, unarmed against the situation, while his housekeeper turned to face 5 trained killers with nothing in her hands at all. He lunged at the door. It didn't move a millimeter. He hit the emergency panel with the flat of his bloody palm, and the wall of small monitors above it flickered to life-grainy, green-tinted night vision feeds from every corner of his house, and he stood there, breathing hard, and he watched. He would watch all of it, and he would never, for the rest of his long and dangerous life, be the same man who'd walked into that foyer. On the screens, the men were fanning through the ground floor in a practiced stack, and the housekeeper had vanished. For one wild moment, Nikolai thought she'd run good. Something in him said, "Run, hide, live. Let me deal with this, the way I deal with everything." And then he caught the shape of her sliding out of a doorway behind the last man in the column, moving with a quietness that was obscene for a woman her size, and he understood in that instant that Grace Bellamy did not do anything at all by accident. Not the shortbread, not the humming, not 11 months of moving through his house like weather. She took the rear man first. She did it the way you turn off a lamp, one arm looping over his shoulder and hooking across his throat, the other hand cupping the back of his skull, her hip dropping, her whole soft weight becoming a lever with the physics already solved, and the man's boots left the floor, and his air left his body. And by the time his 3 nearest companions began to turn at the small scuff of it, he was already sliding down the wall. His rifle caught neatly against Grace's forearm before it could clatter and give her away. Nikolai's breath stopped in his chest. She didn't fire it. That was the detail that started to come apart in him. She took the rifle, checked it with 2 economical movements, then set it down, deliberately, silent, on the runner of the hall carpet, and melted back into the dark. Because a gunshot would bring the others running, and Grace Bellamy was not interested in bringing them running. She was interested in taking them apart one at a time. In the black corridors of a house she had cleaned every single day for 11 months. A house whose every squeaking board and blind corner and heavy candlestick and load-bearing shadow she knew better than the men who had built it. She had chosen this ground. He understood it slowly, with a cold-crawling sensation climbing the back of his neck. She had chosen this ground, and studied it, and made it hers, a long time before tonight. The second man came looking for the first. He moved down the service corridor with his weapon up and his light off, professional, careful, unhurried, and Grace let him come. Nikolai watched her fold her body into the deep shadow of the pantry doorway, watched the stillness settle over her, watched her breathe slow and even. When the man drew level, she came out low and fast and took the outside of his knee with the heel of her hand, and as the joint buckled and he pitched sideways, she guided the fall so that his temple met the marble corner of the counter with a mercy that looked, on the green screen, almost tender. He folded and did not rise. Tfor. Somewhere near the front of the house, a voice hissed a name in a language Nikolai knew well, Serbian, calling for a man who would never answer again. The remaining 3 had begun to understand that something was wrong. Not that they were losing. Men like that don't imagine losing to a house and a maid. But that something was in the dark with them. Something patient. Something that had been waiting for them. Specifically, for a very long time. Nikolai pressed his forehead to the cold steel of the door and watched the woman who left shortbread outside his study hunt armed men through his home, and he felt something rise in his chest that he had not felt since he was young enough to be foolish before the blood, before the empire, before he taught himself, deliberately and well, to feel nothing at all. He felt his heart slam itself against his ribs for someone who was not himself. He should tell you now, before the rest of it, who Grace Bellamy had been. Because he learned it later, all of it, in the low-grey hours when neither of them could sleep and the truth came out of her the way water finds a crack. Once, she had been the best in the country at keeping the wrong people alive. Grace had come up through a private protection world that did not advertise the kind of security that guards the people whose names you'd know and whose enemies you'd never hear about. She was extraordinary at it precisely because of the thing everyone underestimated. No one, ever, looked at a soft-spoken, full-figured woman with warm eyes and a warmer laugh and thought bodyguard. They thought nanny. They thought aunt. They thought, God help them, harmless. And by the time they learned otherwise, she had already closed the distance and put them on the floor. She had built an entire career inside the half-second of surprise that her own body bought her, and, in 11 years, she had never lost a principle. Until Daniel. Daniel Ashford, a federal witness, a decent man, a coward's target, and the night 6 years ago when a ghost named Dragon Moore walked through a security cordon that Grace would have staked her life was airtight, and put 2 rounds through a hotel room door, and took the one life Grace had promised on her own soul to keep. She had been 19 feet away, down the hall, covering the elevator, doing everything correctly. She had heard it happen. And she had spent every day of the 6 years since asking those 19 feet why they had not been 9 or 4 or none. She had walked away from the work after that. Not out of fear. Grace was not built out of the material that fear gets a grip on, but out of a grief so total it hollowed her clean. She could not stand over another human life, and promised to keep it, knowing what she now knew in her body about how thin that promise really was, how a single, ordinary door was all that stood between a promise and a coffin. And then, 11 months ago, an old colleague let her see a file she was not supposed to see, a contract being shopped quietly through the same shadow markets that Dragon Moor haunted, a target, Nikolai Volkov, and beside it, moving the paper, a broker's name Grace knew the way you know a scar, the fixer who handled that particular ghost's work, who had handled the Ashford job. Dragon was back in New York, and sooner or later, patiently, inevitably, he would come for the man on that page. So Grace Bellamy, who could have warned Nikolai, who could have sold the information for enough to disappear on, who could have simply walked away a third time, had instead pressed an apron flat and applied for a job. She would stand near the target. She would learn his house down to its bones. She would wait in the one place on Earth the ghost would eventually be forced to come, and when he came, she would be ready in the way she had not been ready 6 years ago. She did not do it to save Nikolai Volkov. Not at first. She told herself, night after night, that she did it to finally stand between Dragon Moor and someone he'd been paid to kill, and this time, to be 19 feet closer, to win. It was not until much later that she admitted the rest of it, even to herself, that somewhere in 11 months of shortbread and slow mornings, and the sight of a lonely, dangerous man falling asleep at his desk beneath the weight of an empire that gave him nothing warm back somewhere in there, the mission had quietly changed shape in her hands, that she had started leaving the plate outside his door not as cover, but because she could not stand the thought of him working through the black middle of the night with nothing kind in the house. She had come to guard a target. She had stayed, without permission, to protect a man, and she had not let herself feel the difference until the night the glass broke. She did not kill the third man either. Nikolai realized it on the screen with a fresh wave of vertigo that she was being careful, that a woman with her skills, cornered in the dark by trained professionals, was still, deliberately choosing restraint where restraint was possible. She was leaving them breathing where she could, and he could not fathom why, and it unsettled him more than butchery would have, because it meant she was rationing something, saving the whole of her fury, holding it back behind her teeth, for one specific man who had not yet shown his face. The third one nearly cost her. She took him in the library, among the leather-bound books Nikolai owned and never read, and this one was good better than the others, faster, and at the last instant he sensed her, and spun, and got a hand fisted in the front of her apron, and drove her back into the shelves hard enough that Nikolai felt it in his own spine. For one horrible stretch of seconds the fight was ugly and even and close, the man's forearm crushing up under her jaw, a knee coming up, and Nikolai's whole body seized against the useless steel of the door. And then Grace did something with her weight, and the man's own momentum, and the edge of the reading table, folding all three together, and the man went over backward into the wood and the table broke and he did not get up from the wreck of it. 3. Nikolai became aware that he was gripping the door handle hard enough to bleach his knuckles white. He became aware that the bullet in his shoulder had stopped mattering to him some minutes ago. He became aware, with the particular clarity of a man watching the floor of his life drop away, that in 11 months he had spoken perhaps 400 words to this woman, and that he had noticed her only the way you notice good weather, gratefully, thoughtlessly, never once turning to look directly at the son of her, and that this made him a fool of a size no living enemy had ever managed to make him feel. 2 men left, and on the screen, at last, the 2 of them had stopped moving. They had gone still in the great hall beneath the iron chandelier, back to back, guns up, and Nikolai read their body language perfectly, because it was the language of men who have just understood that they are the prey. Then the larger of the 2 lifted his head and spoke into the dark of the house in accented English, in a voice like a door dragged over gravel. "Grace Bellamy," said Dragon Moor. And on the screen, in the black mouth of the dining room doorway, Nikolai saw the shape of her go still. She had known his voice would do that to her. She had promised herself for 6 years that it wouldn't, and she had always, privately, known that it would. Grace stood in the dark 3 feet inside the dining room, close enough to end it, and she let herself feel it for exactly 1 breath, the 6 years, the 19 feet, the sound of 2 rounds through a cheap hotel door, the whole crushing weight of a promise dropped and shattered on a hallway carpet. Then she folded it up small and put it away, because grief is slow and she needed to be very fast, and she measured the room 1 more time in her mind. The doorway, the angles, the winch. She had spent 11 months preparing this room, and she had not, in the end, trusted her plan to loosened bolts, or lucky timing. She had done it like a professional. Weeks ago, on an ordinary afternoon with a rag in her hand and the house empty, she had gone up the service ladder to the great chandelier's mounting and quietly replaced the steel safety pin in the winch mechanism, the one fail-safe that kept the half-ton fixture from ever dropping under its own weight. With an identical-looking pin she had machined herself from a soft, weak alloy. It would hold the chandelier's dead weight indefinitely. It would hold against a slow, careful lowering for cleaning. It would not hold against a single hard, violent yank on the release lever set into the wall behind the drapes. She had tested the geometry. She had marked, in her own mind, the exact square of floor beneath the fixture where a man would fall if the iron came down. All she had ever needed was to get the right man to stand on that square for 1 second, with his eyes off her. She stepped into the light of the great hall so that Dragon Moore could see her face. "You remember me," she said. He did not answer in words. He fired. It came without warning, without a flicker of tell, faster than any of the 4 men she'd already taken. And only 6 years of muscle memory saved her. She was already dropping and rolling behind the marble plinth of a statue as the round cracked past where her chest had been and blew a fist-sized wound in the plaster. The ghost did not pause to gloat. He moved as he fired, driving her, herding her, a second round and a third chewing the edge off the plinth, chips of stone stinging her face, and Grace understood in her body what her mind had always known. This was not one of the 4. This was the man who had walked through her airtight cordon like it was made of smoke. This was the best there had ever been at his work, and he had her pinned, and he was closing the angle with cold, unhurried skill to a killing line she could not survive. She had 1 thing left. She had always known she would come down to 1 thing left. "You always come yourself," Grace called out from behind the ruined stone, and her voice, this was the part she had practiced without letting herself know she was practicing it. Her voice did not shake. "For the big contracts, you can't help it. Volkov, Ashford, the ones that matter, you always come yourself." The firing stopped. Just for a beat. Just for the space of 1 breath. Because being known truly, exactly known, by someone who has studied you for 6 years is its own kind of violence, and it landed on Dragon Moore precisely where she'd aimed it. He was a ghost. Ghosts are not supposed to be seen. "Because it's the only part you still enjoy," Grace said into that silence, and now she let him hear the thing underneath, not fear, never fear, but a terrible, patient certainty. "I've had 6 years to think about you. I know how you move. I know you'll want to look at my face when you do it." She let 1 beat fall, "and I know exactly where you're standing right now." It was a lie wrapped around a truth, and it did to him what she needed it to do. For 1/10 of 1 second, the exact reflex of a predator who has just been told the ground beneath him is a trap. Dragon Moore's eyes flicked up, off her, toward the great iron chandelier hanging above his head. Grace was already moving. She came up out of cover, not toward him, but toward the drapes on the wall, her whole soft weight thrown into the 4 running steps, and her hand closed on the brass release lever behind the fabric. And she did not squeeze it or turn it, she tore it down, with everything 6 years of waiting had put into her arm. The soft alloy pin sheared clean through. The chandelier came down like the falling of a verdict, 1/2 ton of black iron and old crystal dropping out of the dark ceiling with a sound like the house itself inhaling, and Dragon Moore, ghost, phantom, the best there ever was, had time to begin to move and no time at all to finish, and the great fixture took him down onto the exact square of marble Grace Bellamy had marked in her mind 11 months before, and the sound it made was enormous and final, and then there was no sound at all. 4 men breathing somewhere in the dark, 1 ghost, buried, and Grace, alone in the settling dust and the ringing silence, standing at the center of the ruin of the thing she had built her whole exile toward, not moving at all. The panic room door did not open for a long time. Inside the steel box, Nikolai stood with his bloody hand still flat against the door and watched the monitor, watched the dust drift down through the green light and settle on the wreckage of his great hall, watched Grace Bellamy stand alone in the middle of it, with her chest heaving and her apron torn half off her shoulder. He watched her not move for almost a full minute, and he understood because he had spent his life reading the bodies of people at the ends of terrible things that the woman who had just done all of this was, now that it was finished, standing in the rubble of 6 years of her own life and quietly, silently, beginning to come apart. Then, on the screen, she straightened. She wiped her palms down the front of her ruined apron in a gesture so ordinary, so absurdly housekeeper, that it cracked something open in the center of his chest. And she walked, a little unsteadily, to the panic room door, and she leaned her forehead against the cold steel of it, and on the other side, Nikolai leaned his forehead against his side of the same steel, an inch and a wall of metal between them, and she said, in the same soft voice she used every morning to ask whether he wanted his coffee freshened, "It's me. It's Grace. A breath. You can open it now." He opened it. The bolts released and the heavy door swung back, and the smell of it hit him, first cordite and plaster dust and the copper tang of blood, his own and other men's, hanging in the ruined air of his house. And then there was Grace, close, closer than she had ever stood to him, filling the doorway, and neither of them moved and neither of them spoke. She was still, but her hands were not. He looked down and saw them, those soft, capable hands that had a moment ago folded a ghost under half a ton of iron, and they were shaking now, a fine, helpless tremor, the adrenaline going out of her all at once, and leaving her body to reckon the cost. Her fingers found the torn hem of her apron and gripped it, twisting the fabric, holding on to the one small, ordinary thing in reach. And Nikolai watched the tremor travel up her arms and understood that this, the trembling, in the after, was the most human thing he had ever been permitted to see. There was a thin cut high on her cheekbone from the stone chips, a dark line of blood tracking down toward her jaw. Nikolai Volkov did not think. That was itself remarkable. He had not done a single unthinking thing in 20 years. He crossed to the sideboard where the whiskey stood, his whiskey, the good bottle, the one no one else in this house was permitted to touch, the private ritual of a private man, and he poured 2 fingers of it into the heavy glass with a hand that was not quite steady either. And he came back, and he put it into her shaking hands, and folded her cold fingers around it with his own bloodied ones. "Drink," he said. It was not an order. Nikolai Volkov gave orders all day long, and this was not one of them. It came out low and rough, and something else entirely, something that had no practice in his mouth. "Slowly. Sit down before you fall down. You've earned the chair." She looked at the glass. She looked at him, at the black bloom of blood soaked down his shirt, at the man she had shoved into a box to keep alive, standing here now pressing his own untouchable whiskey into her hands. And some final wall in her, the one that had held for 6 years, cracked straight down the middle. She sat, hard, on the arm of the ruined chair. She drank, her eyes closed. Nikolai lowered himself down in front of her, one knee on the wreck of his own floor, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. And he took the edge of his ruined sleeve, and he did the second unthinking thing of the night. He lifted it and, very gently, with a care that would have astonished every man who had ever feared him, wiped the line of blood from her cheek. She went utterly still under his hand, not the killer's stillness he'd watched on the screen. A different one. "You locked me in a box," he said quietly. His voice was not steady. He had not known, until he heard it, that his voice was still capable of not being steady. "You'd have gotten in the way," Grace said. Her eyes came open. There was the ghost of something at the corner of her mouth, the exact expression he had seen 100 times over a morning coffee tray, and never, not once, understood. "You're an excellent target, Mr. Volkov. Terrible bodyguard." And Nikolai Volkov, who had ordered men killed for lesser insults than that, knelt on the ruined floor of his house with his enemy's blood and his own drying on his shirt, and felt himself fall completely, catastrophically, permanently off the edge of the life he had been living, into the one that would have her in it. The truth came the rest of the way out, slowly, over the nights that followed, and he did not let her rush it, and he did not rush toward it. That was the thing that changed in him first, before anything else the patience. Nikolai Volkov had spent his whole life taking. He learned, in those grey weeks, to wait. He learned about Daniel Ashford in the hour before one dawn, when he came down and found her awake at the kitchen island with her hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. He didn't ask. He sat across from her, in a house being slowly rebuilt around them, plaster dust, still ghosting every surface, and he waited, in silence, the way she had taught him to without either of them knowing it was a lesson. And it came out of her the way water finds a crack, the witness, the airtight cordon, the 2 rounds through a cheap hotel door, the 19 feet. She told him about the 19 feet in a voice with nothing left in it, and he understood at last why she had spent the whole battle rationing her fury, and for whom she had been saving it. And then she told him the last thing, the hardest, the one she needed him to have whole so that whatever came next would be built on nothing false. "I didn't come here to save you." She made herself look at him when she said it. "You have to know that. I came to catch him. I knew he'd take the Volkov contract eventually. Men like you always end up on his list, and I knew when he came, he'd come himself. So I put on an apron, and I let you pay me, and feed me, and trust me, and the whole time I was using your house as a trap and using you as the bait to spring it." Her jaw was tight. "That's who I am, Nikolai. That's what I did to you. Under your own roof, for 11 months. He was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere above them, a workman's radio played thin and distant through the empty rooms. "And then," he said. She looked up at him. "You said at first." Nikolai Volkov had built an empire on hearing the word underneath the word, a person said, and he had never in his life listened as closely as he listened now. "The first night. You said, at first, you were bait." He held her eyes across the dust and the cold coffee and the ruin. "Grace. And then—" And so she told him the truth she had been most afraid of, that somewhere in the 11 months, the trap had quietly become a home, and the bait had become a lonely, dangerous man she couldn't stand to watch, working alone at 3 in the morning, and that on the night the glass broke, when she made the split-second choice, with her whole life narrowing to a single point, she had not shoved him into that steel box to protect her bait. She had done it because the thought of losing him was the one grief she already knew, this time, that she would not survive. He did not become soft. Understand that clearly, because it is the whole of what he became instead. Nikolai Volkov did not turn into a gentleman, and Grace would not have wanted a gentleman. She had spent her life around softness that got people killed. What he became was something colder and truer and far more dangerous. A man who had, for the first time, exactly one thing in the world he would burn the world down to protect, and the terrible clarity of finally knowing its name. He tried, in the clumsy way of a man who has never in his life had to want something he couldn't simply reach out and take, to give her the door. He told her she was free, that her debt to a ghost was paid in full and buried under the marble of his great hall, that she never had to stand over another life and make that promise again as long as she lived. He told her she could go anywhere and be anything, that he would open every door in the world for her and then stand well back from all of them, and let her walk through whichever she chose without him in it. Grace listened to the whole of it, standing in the candle-lit study where she had left shortbread on a plate for 11 months. And when he was finished, she crossed the room and stood very close to him, closer than a housekeeper ever stands to the man who employs her, close enough that his breath went still in his chest. "You keep offering me the door," she said quietly. "Nikolai, I have spent 6 years running from a door. I have spent 6 years on the wrong side of one, listening." She reached up slowly the way you reach toward something dangerous, which he was, which he had always been, and laid her warm hand flat against the center of his chest, over the heart he'd spent a lifetime pretending he had buried somewhere no one would find it. "I don't want the way out anymore. I found the thing I want to stand in front of." His hand came up and closed over hers. It was not gentle. Nikolai Volkov held on to her hand, the way a drowning man holds on to the one thing that will either save him or go down into the dark with him, and he looked at her, the full-figured, soft-eyed, impossible woman who had walked into the dark of his house and won him his own life back, and for the first time since he was young enough to believe anything at all, he let another human being see all the way in, to the bottom, where the light didn't usually reach. Then don't move, he said, low and certain and rough as gravel. Stay exactly there, in front of me, for the rest of it. I'll cover the rest. That was always the plan, Grace said, and there it was fully at last. The small smile he had seen 100 times across a coffee tray and never once been permitted to understand. I happen to be very, very good at guarding one specific, difficult man. And Nikolai Volkov, feared by everyone, warm to no one, alone at the top of an empire built on the founding principle that he needed nothing, and no one pulled his housekeeper into his arms in the candlelight, blood and plaster dust and all. And finally, after a lifetime, let himself need something. Outside, the first snow of the winter had begun to fall over New York, quiet and clean and patient, covering the black SUVs still in the drive, covering the shattered east window, covering everything. In a mansion where the great hall would have to be rebuilt from the marble up, where a ghost lay buried under new stone and a plate of shortbread sat forgotten and long cold on the desk. Two dangerous, lonely people who had each spent their whole lives standing guard over the wrong things finally, at long last, stood guard over each other. She had come to catch a killer. She had stayed to keep a man. And Nikolai Volkov would spend the rest of his life making certain that the woman who saved him never once, ever again, had to stand alone in the dark.